There's a war happening right now, but no one sees it. No gunfire, no sirens, no blood in the streets. Just you and yourself. A silent conflict that leaves no visible scars, yet it bleeds from the inside. And perhaps the most painful part, no one else notices, because the battle is internal, and that makes it even more ruthless. Have you ever felt divided, as if two forces live within you, one hungry for growth, and another whispering you'll never make it? One mapping out the path, and another delaying every step. One voice shouting, "Do it now," and another asking, "Why bother if you'll fail again?" That's the cruel trap of self-sabotage. It's not an external enemy. It uses your own voice, your own reasoning, your own fear. It doesn't come to destroy you, it comes to protect you. Even if that protection chains you to a life that no longer fits, to a self-image that feels like a ghost of who you truly are. You promise to wake up early, but sabotage it the night before. You start something new, then stop right before a breakthrough. You crave self-love, yet you criticize yourself until your own light dims. And you know it, you see it, you feel it, but you can't seem to stop. Have you asked yourself why that part of you is so afraid to let go? Why it fears change even when the new path offers freedom and meaning? What if it's not weakness, nor a lack of willpower, but something deeper? An existential struggle between your conscious desire for awakening and your unconscious fear of loss? Maybe the real problem was never you. Maybe it's the way you've learned to handle your inner duality, this hidden war between the self you've been and the self you're becoming. And perhaps, just perhaps, this war was never meant to be won, but understood, integrated, transcended, like a fire that, instead of burning you down, reveals your shadow and your soul. The question is sacred and unavoidable. Are you ready to stop fighting yourself and start reclaiming your power from within? You are not broken, you are in process, and that process doesn't follow a straight line. It won't fit neatly into motivational slogans or 5-step formulas. But the wound of self-sabotage can make you doubt this truth. Many of us grew up believing we had to fix ourselves, to become someone, to align every part of our being. As if somewhere ahead, there's an ideal version of you, flawless, serene, untouchable, waiting to be reached. And every setback becomes proof that you're not ready. But what if the real mistake was believing you have to be fine all the time? You are not a project with a deadline. You are a spiral, sometimes ascending, sometimes retreating, but every turn carrying new meaning. You are not failing. You are awakening from within. You are not an incomplete puzzle. You are living terrain, in constant tension, a sacred zone where who you were, who you want to be, and what the world demands collide. In that collision, there is no judge, only you, trying to decide which voice deserves to be heard. And yes, it hurts. Every step forward touches old suffering. Changing means letting go of versions of yourself that once kept you safe. It means walking away from the shadows that feel familiar. It means challenging the unconscious narratives that have defined your limits. Each time you try to rise, a quiet voice asks, "What if you fail like before?" But what if that voice isn't your enemy? What if the part that sabotages you is simply an older self, born out of trauma, who learned survival by hiding? What if what it needs is not to be defeated, but to be heard? Hegel called this the dialectic, the thesis, your desire for transformation, meeting the antithesis, your inner resistance. From their tension emerges the synthesis, not the elimination of conflict, but its transformation. Even your resistance holds truth. It shows you where fear still lives, and fear, when faced with presence instead of judgment, can become power. You are not your contradiction. You are the space where contradiction exists. In that space, you can choose. Repeat or evolve, hide or integrate, deny or step through the darkness. Perhaps real freedom isn't in silencing your inner war, but in walking with it, awake, present, and holding every part of your soul with compassion. How many times have you frozen, unsure which part of you is truly in control? How many dreams have you abandoned because one part said yes while another screamed, "Why bother? You always fail." This inner war has no uniform, no visible weapons, yet it has strategy. A part of you works full-time to keep you exactly where you are. It knows your weak spots, the scars of old suffering, the fears you've never named. And it uses them, not to destroy you, but to keep you from stepping into the unknown. You want to love, but you fear being broken. You want to move forward, but you dread disappointment. You want to open up, yet the shadow of not being enough stops you. And so you dance between impulse and paralysis, between desire and guilt, until you're stuck. Inside, it feels like a choreography you've rehearsed 1,000 times. One foot forward, the other pulling back. Self-sabotage often disguises itself as reason. It whispers, wait a little longer. Now's not the time. Fix everything else first. And deep down, in the solitude of your unconscious, you know you're just postponing what your soul has long been calling for. The cruel part is, even knowing this, you keep doing it. Because sabotage offers something. It promises safety. It offers the familiar, the predictable, even if it keeps you in darkness. Change feels like jumping into the void. Staying feels like holding on to the old, even if it's slowly suffocating you. And so the cycle repeats. You try to change. Something inside resists. You promise it will be different this time. And then the loop restarts. This cycle doesn't just steal your actions. It steals your identity. You start to believe you are the one who never finishes, the one who always sabotages, the one who can't. But those are lies. Stories built from repeated moments of fear, not truth. Each time you define yourself by your relapse, you reinforce the prison bars. But what if breaking the pattern isn't about forcing massive change overnight? What if it begins by asking, which part of me is afraid, and what is it trying to protect? Self-sabotage is not a defect. It's a distorted form of care, a broken language learned in moments of trauma. Growth begins when you can look that fear in the eye, not to crush it, but to say, I hear you, and this time I will lead. You are not broken. You are in construction. Every building process comes with noise, dust, and instability. You are not lost. You are being tested. And the test is not to defeat yourself, but to remain with yourself, even in your most fragile, unpolished moments. For Hegel, there is no birth of consciousness without conflict. The human soul does not awaken in stillness. It awakens in friction. That constant clash between desire, belief, memory, and fear is not a flaw. It is the furnace where your truth is forged. Life, he argued, does not move in a straight line, but in a spiral. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then again, collision, tension, integration, an eternal rhythm where the new can only emerge after meeting the old. And you are that rhythm, a dialectical self, a being in constant negotiation with your own shadow. Every decision is a stage where different parts of you fight for the right to exist. In this view, self-sabotage isn't a mistake to be erased. It is the antithesis rising against a thesis that seeks change. It is the part of you that doesn't yet believe in the freedom beyond familiar suffering. And when you try to silence that part, it doesn't vanish. It grows sharper, louder, more desperate. Hegel would say that real growth happens not when one idea destroys another, but when both transform into something higher. Synthesis doesn't erase the conflict. It changes its shape, turning it into meaning. That transformation isn't fast, and it's never comfortable. It demands presence. It demands the courage to sit in solitude, inside your own darkness, without rushing toward false light. Most people crave clarity without crossing the fog, healing without touching the wound, awakening without surrendering the ego. But you, still here, still listening, are proof that a part of your soul refuses to run. That part longs for truth, not just comfort. It's ready to endure the discomfort of letting go of illusions, even when the unconscious still trembles. The part of you that seeks to advance is real, but so is the part that resists. Both are born from authentic experience, from the deep soil of past trauma and old narratives. To deny either is to tear yourself apart. Hegel didn't speak of halves. He spoke of wholeness, and wholeness requires integration, not exile. Synthesis is inviting your contradictions to the table, looking them in the eye and saying, I see you, and I choose to move forward anyway. Even behind your self-sabotage lies ancient wisdom, a twisted language that pleads, please, don't break again. It's in that moment, right there, that alchemy begins. The wound becomes a bridge, the shadow becomes a guide, the suffering becomes a teacher. You are not failing because you are divided. You are maturing. Division is the womb of transformation. There is no true freedom without contradiction, no real peace without surviving the storm, no awakening without walking through darkness. Spirit, the expanded soul, only flourishes when it dares to contradict itself and still create power out of chaos. So stop running. Stand at the center of your confusion. Feel yourself being many in one, and from that trembling stillness, discover you were never a mistake. You were always possibility. Enough of waging war against yourself. It's time to strip away the excuses and speak truth to your own soul. The part of you that sabotages isn't evil. It's not a traitor within your mind. It is a fragment of yourself that once learned to survive using the only tools it had. It fears change because the old, even in suffering, feels safer than the unknown. And in a world shaped by uncertainty, the familiar can feel like power, even when it's a prison cell you built unconsciously. That hesitant voice, the one that interrupts, delays, doubts, isn't trying to ruin you. It is your younger self, your shadow child, born in moments of trauma when hiding felt safer than being seen. It's the self that decided silence was better than rejection, retreat better than risk. That version of you was forged when survival was the only goal. But today, survival is no longer enough. Now, you are being called to live. Look at that part of you. Don't turn away. Sit with it in solitude, in the quiet darkness where it still hides. Listen, not to obey, but to understand its broken language. Tell it, I know you're afraid, but I am here now, and this time I will not abandon you. This is not weakness. This is awakening. This is the kind of inner truth that dissolves the illusions of the ego and makes room for real freedom. Turn the battlefield into a table of reconciliation. Don't seek victory, seek integration. Let your parts speak to each other. Show the doubting voice that moving forward doesn't mean betrayal. It means expansion. That letting go isn't abandonment. It's choosing meaning over fear. That power isn't about dominating the self. It's about holding your suffering with dignity, without letting it dictate your future. You will not erase your shadow. You will learn to walk beside it. You don't need to bury your darkness to move forward. You need to honor it as a chapter in your story, one that no longer defines your destiny. This is how the unconscious becomes conscious, how the parts of you once trapped in fear begin to trust again. Every time you choose presence over reaction, you transform. Every small conscious act becomes a rebellion against the old narrative that said, you can't, but now you can. You are becoming someone who no longer needs an inner war to grow. Someone who can look in the mirror and say, I accept all that I am, and I still choose to move. That is the kind of power that doesn't shout, it radiates. Being whole is not about perfection, it's about truth. It's about walking through solitude and uncertainty while carrying every part of your soul with respect. It's knowing that the self is not a polished statue, but a living organism, sometimes scarred, sometimes trembling, but always capable of growth. And here is the paradox. When you stop trying to defeat the parts of you that resist, they soften. The inner resistance that once felt like an enemy becomes an ally. Its warnings become guidance. Its fears become maps to your deepest needs. Even your suffering begins to speak a different language, one that leads you toward the kind of freedom that no external power can give or take away. You are not just your past. You are the pulse that insists, the quiet force that resists despair, the self that refuses to vanish. You are the soul that keeps awakening, even in darkness. And when you finally see that the war was never about destroying the enemy within, but about learning to carry every part of yourself with compassion, that is when you become unstoppable. You don't need to defeat yourself. You need to reclaim yourself with firmness, with tenderness, with the courage to keep moving, even when the path is uncertain. Because this is what it means to live beyond survival. This is what it means to finally step into the full meaning of your life. The war within you continues, but only as long as you keep feeding both sides with fear. The truth, though uncomfortable, is that you hold the power to stop it. Not by rushing, not by punishing yourself, but by choosing presence over avoidance. By deciding, in a silent and sacred moment, to no longer run from your own soul. Maybe right now, you don't have all the answers. Maybe your mind still feels like a maze of contradictions, but you have something far more valuable than answers. You have the willingness to look within, and that willingness changes everything. Because the real turning point is not when you figure everything out, but when you stop asking, how do I get rid of my shadow? And start asking, how can I care for the parts of me that still don't know how to trust? You don't need to annihilate your inner conflict. You need to transform it into a bridge, into a dialogue, into a living source of meaning. Inside you, there are no true enemies, only fragments waiting to be heard, to be integrated, to be honored. That is the truth most people never dare to face, and that's why their awakening remains shallow, cosmetic. Yours doesn't have to. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel your breath as it moves in and out. Remember every time you thought you had reached the end, and still somehow, you stood back up. Remember the nights you carried suffering like a stone in your chest, and yet you saw another sunrise. You are not lost. You are in transit. You are crossing through the darkness toward a deeper freedom. And the path you walk is sacred, because it is entirely yours. If you've come this far, it's not by accident. Something inside you, perhaps small, perhaps trembling, has already begun to awaken. Something in you has decided, enough. Enough of letting the unconscious steer your life. Enough of being ruled by the echoes of old trauma. Enough of letting the ego cling to the illusion of control. This moment is not about becoming someone else. It's about reclaiming every part of yourself, shadow and light, weakness and strength, and learning to move as one. It's about letting go of the need for perfection and embracing the wholeness of your soul. That is real power. That is real truth. So here is my invitation. Not just to listen, but to act. Not for me, but for you. For the self you've ignored, the voice you've silenced, the freedom you've postponed. Write it. Say it. Own it. I am the synthesis. Let those words be more than affirmation. Let them be a declaration of war against the idea that you are broken. Let them be a promise to your own soul that you will no longer abandon it in the middle of the night. This is not the end of your story. This is the chapter where you stop surviving and start living, where you stop trying to destroy your shadow and instead walk beside it, where you stop fearing the darkness because you've learned that the darkness was never empty. It was full of the pieces of yourself you needed to reclaim. From this day forward, carry your suffering with dignity, not as a chain, but as a mark of what you've endured and survived. Stand in your solitude without shrinking from it, because solitude is not the absence of connection. It's the forge where the soul gains its sharpest clarity. Step into your freedom without apology. Speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. Live with the kind of power that doesn't need to dominate, only to be whole. If you're still here reading these words, you've already proven something. You are willing to face yourself, and that is rarer and more revolutionary than most people will ever understand. So subscribe, stay connected, not to follow another stream of empty promises, but to be part of a space where we walk deep together. No shortcuts, no pretense, just truth in all its beauty and brutality. You don't need to be perfect to begin. You only need to be willing to be complete. And completeness is not about polishing away your scars. It's about learning to move through life with every part of your soul awake. Because one day, you will look back at this moment, not as the time you decided to win the war, but as the moment you decided to end it. And that will change everything.